Okay, today we're going to be learning Yevamot Daf Nun Aleph. Today's daf is sponsored by Ellie Gelman in memory of her husband, Reuven Gelman, Reuven Shimon ben Shragadov, whose yurtzeit was on Chol HaMoed Pesach. Talmid Chacham, research scientist and teacher. He loved the intersection of science and Torah learning, especially enjoyed the obscure and improbable sugyot. I know he would have had something fascinating to say about every daf, maybe particularly this one as well. Okay, speaking of obscure. So what we're going to do today is understand better this machloket between Rabban Gamliel and the rabbis in our Mishnah, where if we go back to the beginning of the Mishnah, Rabban Gamliel Omer, I'm now reading on Nun Amud Aleph on the Mishnah, beginning of the chapter, Ein get achar get velo ma'amal achal ma'amal. Okay, we're focusing specifically on this part of it. Also, bi'ila achar bi'ila and chalitza achar chalitza, that's more simple because Ein chalitza achar chalitza because you already fulfilled the mitzvah of yibum. Ein bi'ila achar bi'ila because you already fulfilled the mitzvah of yibum. The more complicated ones are ein get achar get ve'ein ma'amar achar ma'amar. Okay, where the rabbis say yesh get achar get, yesh ma'amar achar ma'amar. Now I'm going to talk about the basic case where we're going to assume we're talking about one brother with two wives. He gives a get to one and then he gives a get to the other. He does ma'amar with one and then he does ma'amar with the other. According to Rabban Gamliel, the second one has no validity. Again, what would it mean if we said it's valid? It would mean, number one, you need to, if it's get, achar get, what it means is you're forbidden to her relatives, remember? Because if a get is valid, remember, get is not valid if you're not married. Here, they're not married. But because she's for his Yevamah, because get is like chalitza, the rabbis instituted that we're going to say there's validity to get, which means that you're now forbidden to her relatives. It's as if you were connected. Just like if you do chalitza, you're also forbidden to her relatives. So ein get achar get means the second get, he's not forbidden to the second woman's relatives because, again, we're talking about two wives that were married to his brother. They fall to yibum to him when the brother dies childless. So the second get has no validity. He's not forbidden to the relatives. Ma'amar achar ma'amar, what's the relevance? If ma'amar is valid, or we'd say the second ma'amar is not valid, well, ma'amar requires get because it's kiddushin, and it's like kiddushin. Kiddushin, you need a get from, even though kiddushin is engagement, but it's halachic engagement, you would require a get. So therefore, if you say ein ma'amar achar ma'amar, it means the first one he did ma'amar to, he'd have to give her a get. The second one, he wouldn't need to. So now we want to understand what's the basis for his opinion, and we'll get to what's the basis for the rabbis for saying it is valid. So Amar Rava, last two words on yesterday's daf. My time de Rabban Gamliel. What's his reason? So the way the structure is going to work is Rava is going to bring an explanation. Abaye is going to knock out his explanation based on a braita that describes more about Rabban Gamliel's approach. And then Abaye is going to bring his own explanation for Rabban Gamliel, and then he's going to bring an explanation for the rabbis. So that's how we're going to go for the first part. What's the reason for Rabban Gamliel? So Rava claims, he doesn't know, get idache, ilo dache, ma'amar ikane, ilo kane. What does a get do? Get pushes off the woman, right? It basically says, you're supposed to be with me. I'm supposed to do yibum. I'm not interested. Gives her a get, right? Because it's like chalitza. It just isn't as strong as chalitza, but it's the same idea. He's disconnecting. So the suffix about get, what we're not sure about is, does it disconnect or does it not? Okay, we're going to get to why this is relevant. So hold off. We don't really understand yet how we get from there to ein get achar get and ein ma'amar achar ma'amar. But right now, let's just get the concept. He doesn't understand, right? He's not sure. Does the get push off the connection between them or does it not? Ma'amar ikane, ilo kane. We actually saw, if you remember, a big machloket Beit Shammai Beit Hillel. Is ma'amar koneh kinyan gamur? Remember, we had a whole debate. What does it really mean, kinyan gamur? We're going to get back to this at the end of today's stuff. Is ma'amar, does it connect them or does it not connect them? Does it make that there's a way, it's like an acquiring, like a kiddushin or not? Right? Kiddushin is koneh, but is ma'amar koneh or is it not koneh? And that's why he says ein ma'amar achar ma'amar. Okay, so how does that all work? Now the Gemara is going to explain. Get idache lo dache. Let's go through the get first. I kamadache batramai ka'avid. However you look at it, we're going to go, the two tracks. Either it pushes off the zika, right? It disconnects them, or it doesn't disconnect them. If it's successful in disconnecting them, right? I kamadache, if it means the first get disconnected, right? Which means it got rid of the zika, like chalitza would. If it did, well then batramai ka'avid. Well then the second get, now it's one thing to say we're giving validity to a get when they're not even married. But that's when there is zika, there's something. So the get loose, right? Like disconnects it. But if you already disconnected it, then with the second woman, there's no validity to the get whatsoever because there's no longer any connection. So that's number one option, right? Number two, ikama lo dachet. Let's say get doesn't push off zika. Well, if it doesn't, then theoretically it shouldn't be forbidden to our relatives because they didn't do anything. But right, misafek, we're going to forbid them to the relatives, but for sure, batra nami lo dachet. Either way, the second one is not going to be a problem because, again, according to the second option, if the get doesn't really do anything, well, then it didn't do anything to the second one either. So the first one, you still have to worry and forbid to the relatives because maybe it worked. But if it did work in the first, it certainly didn't work in the second because it was already done in the first and there's nothing to do for the second. And if it didn't work for the first, it's not going to work for the second. So either which way, however you play out the scenario, the second one is an irrelevant action. That's big. That's ein get achar get. Now, ma'amar achar ma'amar is going to be the same idea. Ma'amar ikane ilo kane. So again, let's try the two tracks. Ikamai kane, if it really is koneh kinyan gamur, it's as if she's his, well then batra mai ka'avid. Well then the second action he does with the second woman is totally irrelevant because he's already acquired her, the first one, which means there's no chiyuv with the second one, there's no connection. Ma'amar is useless, right? Ma'amar is only to get you to yibum. If it's already as if he almost did yibum with the first, well then the second action is irrelevant. And ikamai lo kane, and if the first one, it wasn't a kinyan at all because ma'amar doesn't work, well, then again, batranami lo kane. The second one, obviously, that it wouldn't work either. So again, either which way you play out the scenario, right? The first one is going to be 50-50. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. That's what we're going to treat it because of the 50-50. The second one, 100% is not a relevant action. That's Rabban Gamliel, according to Rava, who I already told you that we're going to reject this. So comes Abaye. Eitive Abaye. I don't agree with you, Abaye says, that the whole reason is based on this doubt, right? Because everything from Rava came from Rabban Gamliel is misupaki doesn't know, but either which way you play out the scenario, according to the doubt, either it works, either it doesn't, right? Either the get pushes it off, the zika, or it doesn't. Either the ma'amar is koneh, it acquires her, or it doesn't. That can't possibly be Rabban Gamliel's approach. Why not? So Eitiv Abaye. Umode Rabban Gamliel. We're now going to have 4 cases where Rabban Gamliel agrees with the rabbis that something after something would be valid. Okay, the first 2 don't really raise a question. I'll explain to you right away why. Umode Rabban Gamliel sheyesh get achar ma'amar u'ma'amar achar get. He agrees that if first you give a get to one woman, then you do ma'amar with the second, then the get forbids you to her relatives, right? It has validity. And the ma'amar means you're going to need a get to get out of the ma'amar. It's going to be valid. Why? Well, because again, each one is 50-50. We don't know which way it goes. So when you have get and then ma'amar, you're going to look at each of them separately because each of them do different things, right? Get either disconnects you or not. And then either which way, right? Then you're going to have ma'amar. Ma'amar maybe connects you, maybe doesn't. So the doubts are all still there because it's not like you're doing one and then the same action. So that actually makes sense according to what Rava said, that either get them ma'amar or ma'amar and then get, because each one, 50-50, what it does, and each one does something different. But get achar bi'ah u'ma'amar achar bi'ah v'get. He also agrees in these cases, and this is going to be more complicated, but we'll see in a minute. Let's just talk about the case. Get achar bi'ah u'ma'amar means there were 3 Yevamot, okay, he had 3 wives, and he did, again, we're getting much more theoretical, right? It was unlikely people really had 3 wives, but what did he do? He did, okay, it's said in the wrong order. It's saying get after bi'ah and ma'amar. What it really means is, first you did ma'amar with the first woman, then you did bi'ah with the second, then you did get with the third. Now, normally, if you do bi'ah first, remember what we said? Bi'ah at the beginning, that's it, you're done. You did yibum. Here, the bi'ah happened after you did ma'amar with a different wife. That's what we call, if you remember, we had this whole concept of chalitza psula, which means a weakened chalitza, because you already, if you do get and then chalitza, it's going to be a weakened chalitza because you've already somewhat severed the zika by the get. Likewise here, you're going to have ma'amal with one, which precludes you from doing yibum with the others. So if you sleep with the next one, then that's already a weakened bi'ah. Okay, so keep that in mind. Let's just read now. So if you have ma'amal, bi'ah, and get, Or flip the order of the get and ma'amar, leave the bi'ah in the middle, but do get, which again, severs your ties, which means you're not allowed to actually at that point marry any of the women. You have to do chalitza, but then you had relations with the second woman. And then the third one, you did ma'amal. Or the things after the ma'amar, okay, in this case, the things at the end after the bi'ah are valid. So your get is valid, your bi'ah is valid, and your ma'amar is valid. What does that mean? So it means, first of all, right, where Rabban Gamliel said, "Ein get achar get and ein ma'amar achar ma'amar," he does agree in this case, there is, all these actions are relevant. We're going to see why this creates a conflict to Rava's explanation. But let's just explain first what this would mean. It would mean the woman you did ma'amar with, whether it was at the beginning or at the end, you'd have to give a get to. It means the woman you did bi'ah with, you would also have to give a get to, because your bi'ah is effective in the sense that it was as if you tried to kind of marry her. So you have to undo it with a get. And the woman you did get with, you're forbidden to her relatives because you connected yourself to her, right? So now, why is this a question? Well, he says, okay, I'm just telling you right now that I'm explaining this according to Rabbeinu Chananel. There's a bunch of different ways to understand this line. It's a little bit of a complicated line. I thought that Rabbeinu Chananel seemed like first of all, the easiest way to explain it and fits the best with the words of the Gemara. So I'm going to go with his explanation, but you should know that if you're looking in commentaries, you might see something different. If he really thinks the ma'amar is maybe kona, maybe not, and get is maybe doche, maybe pushes off the zika, maybe doesn't, well, tahavi kibi'ah lechatchila v'tikne. Tahatznan, okay, I'll just read for 1 minute and then I'll explain. As it says in a Mishnah we saw, bi'ilah bizman shi b'tchila en achareha klum. If the bi'ilah is the first thing, there's nothing after it. Now, he's going to say that in these cases, bi'ilah wasn't the first thing, but it's as if it was the first thing. Why? If you say that ma'amar and get is safek, now bi'ilah is vadai, right? Bi'ilah we know works to do yibum. Ma'amar, we don't really know. That's the whole thing that Rava explains in Rabban Gamliel. And get, we don't really know. So the way Rabbeinu Chananel words it is, ein safek motzim mitei vadan. If we have a definite action here, we have two suffix actions, well, the definite action should take precedence. So it should be as if it was ma'amar first, if it was get first, as if those didn't even happen. And as if the bi'ilah was first. And then if we view the bi'ilah as being first, because that was a vadai action, it was an action that for sure in a normal circumstance could affect yibum, then that should override the other two, the whatever happened before it, and it should be a good yibum, and it's not. So clearly, again, it's not so clear, and that's why there's different explanations how to read this line, but clearly Rabban Gamliel doesn't think it's a suffix, because if he thought it was a suffix, again, something would have been different here, right? And the bi'ilah would have worked. Why it would have worked? So I gave you Rabbeinu Chananel's explanation because that's vadai and that's suffix. There's other explanations given, but we'll stick with that. So Ela Amar Abai. So Abai now comes and says it's not that he wasn't sure if it works or not. Le'olam pshita le'lo Rabban Gamliel beget didachei u'ma'amar dekan. He definitely agrees that ma'amar is koneh and get is doche. Now, obviously, you have to say bimiktzat, a little bit, not fully. If it worked fully, then you would have fulfilled your mitzvah of yibum, and you did it. Okay, but what he's going to say is ma'amar definitely connects you to this woman. Okay, and get definitely removes the zika somewhat. Okay, now you have to explain. So why is ein get achar get ein ma'amar achar ma'amar? And this is very kind of obvious. He says miu amar rabbanan. So therefore, the rabbis say, this is Rabban Gamliel's explanation. It says Rabbanan, it means, this is where Rabban Gamliel says, Ha Yevamot bechad sad mahani baget, ubechad sad mahani b'ma'amar, right? In a certain way, right? It works somewhat, right? It's an effective action. It's not like it's an effective action because maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. That was Rava. No, it actually works. It works in a partial manner. So now, think about it. If get works in a partial manner to remove this zika, if you do another of the exact same action that works partially, we're not going to say, let's just put a percentage. Get removes 50% of the zika. And then you do another get to the other woman. It can't remove the other 50% of the zika. It will only remove whatever the 50% of the zika that the first get removed, it'll remove here as well. So that's ineffective because you've already, whatever power it has, the second one is only going to have the same power as the first. And if it was already done by the first, then it's irrelevant for the second. That's what we're going to see. We'll read it inside. So again, ha Yevamot, this Yevamot, the first one who got the get, b'chad sad mahane baget, right? So it worked to remove the zika somewhat. Ubechad sad mahane ba'ma'amar. If it was the case of ma'amar, the ma'amar works somewhat to acquire. Get achar get lo dache, but the second one is not going to be docha anything, dahad dache lekama, because the first one already took care of whatever power the get had was done by the first. So the second one has nowhere to go. This is more like ein bishul achar bishul. You've already cooked it. So what does it mean to cook it again? Right? You're just warming it up. That's not cooking. So whatever power the get had, the first get did it already. There's nothing left for the second get to do. Umamar chamamar lo kane da kane lekama. He already acquired the first one. If it works to acquire, it works to acquire in a partial manner. Well, whatever it acquired, it acquired. There's no room to do the same thing to a second woman because you've already done whatever could be done here. Okay, so therefore, that's why it's not relevant. But get achar ma'amar, ma'amar achar get, but going back to the case where Rabban Gamliel agrees, when you have a get after ma'amar, you have ma'amar after a get, hamilta kadache v'hamilta kakane, right? The get can disconnect you somewhat. The ma'amar can connect you somewhat. So if you do get and then you do ma'amar, each one, right? The get disconnects you, the ma'amar connects you. So that's fine because they're doing different actions. So you could have one after the other. So now what about the rabbis? Now the rabbis, this seems actually pretty convincing. So how do the rabbis say, yesh get achar get and yesh ma'amar achar ma'amar? Kol chad v'chad zakinu le'Rabbanan get u'ma'amar b'Yevamot. Each, right, when you have a brother with two Yevamot, each Yevamah, right, theoretically, each one has a different relationship, right? Yes, get disconnected him with that woman, but he has a unique relationship with the other woman as well. So basically, whatever he does to the second woman will be on the second woman. Here we're splitting the two women, where theoretically it could be two Yevamim, two brothers with one Yevamah, right? They each have their own unique connection with each other. So what one does to one is still, you could do the same thing with the other one. So that's the rabbi's explanation. Now we're going to go back to this case we saw. We saw Modeh Rabban Gamliel, which we just explained the first two, right? Get achar ma'amar, ma'amar achar get. Now we're going to talk about this case. Get achar bi'al ma'amar, ma'amar achar bi'al get, which sounds a little complicated, but again, it just really means there's three women, right? Three wives who all fell to Yibum, to let's say one person. He did get and then bi'ilah and then ma'amal, right? With each different one, or the reverse, right? Bi'ilah is always in the middle. Either it starts with get and ends with ma'amar, or starts with ma'amar, ends with get. So now we're going to focus on one aspect of this. Hi bi'apsula. Again, remember, this is called the bi'apsula because he already really isn't allowed to do yibum with her. So his bi'ilah is weakened. Remember, because anytime you can't do yibum, so your chalitza is weakened. And again, the bi'ilah would be weakened because you can't do yibum. So bi'apsula, adifa mimamar ugri'a mimamar. Now I'm going to say, based on what we see here, it's actually stronger than ma'amar in a certain way and weaker than ma'amar in another way. How so? This is just a comment Abaye makes. Right? We've already finished with his explanations for Rabban Gamliel and the rabbis. Adifa mi ma'amar di'ilu ma'amar achar ma'amar lo mahane. Right? Ma'amar after ma'amar, according to Rabban Gamliel, doesn't work. But ilu bi'a achar ma'amar mahane. But what do you see here? If you do ma'amar and then bi'ilah, it's going to work, right? Meaning, what does it mean it's going to work? Well, you're going to have to give her a get, right? It doesn't work to fulfill your mitzvah of yibum, but you have to give her a get. It's not a bi'ilat znud, as we say, right? It's not a meaningless act, but it was an act of bi'ilat for the mitzvah. You couldn't have fulfilled the mitzvah, but you still need a get to get out of it. So you see that bi'ilah after ma'amar works, even though ma'amar after ma'amar doesn't work. So that shows bi'ilah has a certain strength that ma'amar doesn't have. Ve'ilu bi'a achar ma'amar, ugri'ami ma'amar, it's worse than ma'amar. Why? Because it's weaker. Te'ilu ma'amar achar haget kani lekula shiura de get. Ve'ilu bi'achar get lo kani lekula shiura beget. When you do ma'amar achar get, what did we say? The ma'amar is fully valid, right? Whatever ma'amar can do, this ma'amar did, right? Which means basically you're going to need a get to get out of it. But the bi'ilah, if you have intercourse after get, what happens? It's not strong enough. It's strong enough to require you a get, but it's not strong enough to do what bi'ilah normally allows you to do, which is yibum. So you see here that ma'amar was fully effective because it does whatever ma'amar normally does, but the bi'ilah is not fully effective. Okay, so that's how you see that ma'amar is stronger to a certain extent than the be'ilah in that scenario. So what he's basically doing is taking that case and then kind of zooming in from a certain perspective and saying, if you look at it like this, right, and you compare the two, you'll see that it's got a certain strength over ma'amar and another weakness. Now we're going to go into a braita, and we're going to pull up the presentation, which talks about more detailed of these cases. We're going to bring all sorts of cases, what you would have expected. We thought the Mishnah was doing when the Mishnah said Ketzad, but it turns out it wasn't really giving us cases of Ein Get Achar Get and Yesh Get Achar Get, or Ein Mamar Achar Mamar, Yesh Mamar Achar Mamar. We're now going to go through the cases of Rabban Gamliel and the rabbis, where you see Ein Get Achar Get, and give some different possibilities, permutations of the situation. Okay, so let's start our presentation. Ketzad Amar Rabban Gamliel Ein Get Achar Get. Okay, in what case, what does it mean, Yesh, right? Ein Get Achar Get. So Shtei Yevamot Shenaflu Lifnei Yabam Echad. Okay, we have the case, the first case is going to be two women, right? So Reuven had two wives, Yael and Shula. And what happened? They both, right? Reuven dies and they both fall to Yibum, to Shimon. Now, what did he do? So this is what we explained just before, right? Natan get lizo v'get lizo. So first he gives a get to Yael, and then he gives a get to Shula. So what does Rabban Gamliel say in this case? We're going to have one more addition to that we didn't see before. Rabban Gamliel Omer, choletz larishona, Shimon should do chalitza with Yael, ve'asur bekrovotea umutar bekrovot hashniya. Shimon is then prohibited to Yael's relatives. Number one, because he gave her a get, that already prohibited him to the relatives, and all the more so because he did chalitza also, but even before that. And mutar bekrovot shniya. Shimon will be permitted to Shula's relatives because Ein Get Achar Get. Now, you might be wondering, why choletz larishona? Remember all the cases we saw yesterday? It doesn't matter which one you do chalitza with. So the commentaries explain that we're talking here, not that you have to do chalitza to Yael, but that better off, it's good advice to do chalitza with Yael. Why? Because it's going to narrow, it's not going to limit Shimon. Why? Yael, by virtue of the fact that he gave her a get first, and that get was valid, he's already forbidden to Yael's relatives. If he does chalitza now to Shula, remember, he gave a get to Shula, that was an irrelevant action according to Rabban Gamliel, so he's permitted to her relatives. But if he does chalitza with Shula, what's going to happen? The chalitza is going to forbid him to her relatives. So therefore, better to do the chalitza to Yael, and then he won't be forbidden to any more relatives. Okay, that's the first. Chachamim omrim, what do the rabbis say? Remember, they think yesh get achar get. So Natan get lizo v'get lizo. If he gives a get to Yael and then gives a get to Shula, so asur b'krovot shtehen, he's forbidden to both of them. And chalitza le'echat mehen, right? You only need chalitza to one of them. It could be Yael in this case, and it could be Shula. It makes no difference because both of them are forbidden to him anyway, right? Their relatives are forbidden. We can do the exact same thing, Ein Get Achar Get and Ein Mamar Achar Ma'amal, if you had two brothers of Reuven, meaning there were three brothers altogether, and one Yevamot. So there was Yael was married to Reuven. Reuven died. Shimon gave a get to Yael, and then Levi gave a get to Yael. So again, what are we going to say? According to Rabban Gamliel, Shimon would do chalitza with her, and Shimon's prohibited to her relatives, and Levi is permitted to her relatives because his get is totally irrelevant. Okay, now, the Chachamim, what would they say? The rabbis would say, oh, both are prohibited because yesh get achar get. So both are prohibited. Next case. Now we want to do ma'amar achar ma'amar. So again, we're going to do Rabban Gamliel first, who says, Ein ma'amar achar ma'amar. The second ma'amar is irrelevant. So again, we're starting with Shtei Yevamot shenaflu lifnei Yabam Echad, right? Two Yevamot fall to one Yabam. Asa ma'amar bezo ma'amar bezo. So Reuven's two wives fall to Shimon to Yibum. He does ma'amar with Yael, and then he does ma'amar to Shula. So what's Rabban Gamliel going to say? Yael needs a get because her ma'amar was valid. Notain get larishona. And again, better off to do chalitza with her because he already gave her a get. So, he's going to give her a get. So he's going to anyway be forbidden to her. And asur b'krovoteha, and therefore he's forbidden to her relatives. And mutar b'krovot shniya. He's going to be permitted to Shula's relatives as long as he doesn't do chalitza with her. Because again, the ma'amar was irrelevant. She doesn't need a get from it. And therefore he's not forbidden to her relatives. Chachamim omrim noten get l'shnehem. V'asur b'krovot shtehen. V'chalitza le'echad mehem. So he does ma'amar to both. Both need a get because Chachamim hold yesh ma'amar achar ma'amar, and you could do chalitza either to Yael or to Shula. It makes no difference. Next case. Same thing you could say with three brothers, right? Where there's end up being two Yevamim. Reuven had Shimon and Levi as brothers, and Shimon did Ma'amar with Yael, and then Levi did Ma'amar with Yael. So she's going to need a get from both of them. Okay, and obviously then she'll be forbidden to both of their relatives. Okay, so that's that case. Next. Okay, now we're going to look back into the Gemara. We're done with the presentation for one quick minute. Amar Mar. Now we're going to go back to something it says in this Braita that we just quoted. Okay, we're going to basically be dealing with this Braita until the middle of Amud Bet. Amar Mar. Notain get lizov get lizov. Going back to the very first case where we said he has to give a get to both of them. Okay, I'm sorry. He gives a get to both of them, and then we say the second one is invalid according to Rabban Gamliel. So Rabban Gamliel Omer, remember what he said? Choletz la rishona. He has to do chalitza with the, or he should do chalitza with the first one. And asur b'krovotea and mutar b'krovot shniya. So again, his only connection right now is to the first one, so he's permitted to the second one's relatives. Let us suggest that this is a difficulty with Shmuel. Now we have to go back to something we saw in Kaftet, which was this opinion of Shmuel, Damar Shmuel, Chalatz the Baalat Haget lo niftirat sarad. Do you remember this whole thing? Okay, let's go through the case. We had Shimon, in this case, the Gemara used Reuven's name in a different way, so when we switched the case, we switched who's who. Shimon is the one who was married to Yael and Shula. Okay, then what happened? Shimon died. Okay, Reuven gave a get to Yael, which again, he shouldn't have, but he did anyway. Now, what happens at this point? If he does chalitza, chalatz the baalat haget, if he does chalitza to the woman he gave a get to, this is our classic case of chalitza psula. Remember, it's a weakened chalitza because he already somewhat severed the connection by giving her a get. So we say in this case, lo niftirat sarah. Shula is not exempt, meaning she can't go marry anyone she wants yet because the zika of when you do a chalitza psula, it's not strong enough to get rid of the zika of Shula. So therefore, what's going to happen? He needs to also do chalitza to Shula. Now, what did we just say here? In our case, he gave a get to the first one, and then he did chalitza. That's all he needs. He doesn't need to do chalitza to Shula. Remember, that was the whole thing. She'll be permitted to his relatives. There's no issue. So it sounds like Rabban Gamliel's position is a difficulty to Shmuel because Rabban Gamliel doesn't require chalitza to both of them, and Shmuel does. The exact same case, right? So now, Amar L'cha Shmuel, right? The only difference is that in this case, he didn't give a get to Shula, but that was an irrelevant point to Rabban Gamliel anyway. In other words, Rabban Gamliel was talking about the second get and is irrelevant. But the point is, in this case, he did chalitza to Yael, and that was enough according to Rabban Gamliel, right? When he did chalitza to the one he gave a get to, even though it was a weakened chalitza and it shouldn't have worked to exempt Shula, according to Shmuel. So this sounds like a difficulty to Shmuel. How could Shmuel answer this? Amar L'cha Shmuel, ki amrei ana, liba demand amar, yesh zika. For Rabban Gamliel, savar ein zika. So I'll answer you very simply. Rabban Gamliel must have held, differently than me, Rabban Gamliel must have held ein zika. And that's why a chalitza psula is enough. Because if you don't have strong zika, if you don't hold that zika is serious, then, right, this is answers we've given on previous questions, which is, we have a different approach to zika in general. Shmuel said, the weakened chalitza doesn't exempt your tzara because you have a very strong zika, and this only removed it partially, and you need to remove the other part, right? It's not strong enough. But in the case of Rabban Gamliel must not hold like me, and he must think there isn't zika at all, and that's why where there's very weakened zika, and that's why the chalitza psula is enough to get rid of the zika. So again, in the case of get achar get, where he already gave a get to the first woman, and then he does chalitza to her, that's sufficient to get rid of whatever zika there is, because there's really not a lot of zika. Okay, right? Whether ein zika means there's no zika at all, or just right, we don't take it very seriously. So now we're going to get into a problem with this, because then we're going to assume what Rabban Gamliel must hold ein zika, because we just explained that. Otherwise, Shmuel would be stuck, right? So Shmuel is going to say, he just holds by a different approach to me, and that's how I can ignore him. So then what? Shmuel must hold like the rabbis, right? And then the rabbis must hold yesh zika, because we're going to assume machloka Rabban Gamliel and the rabbis. It must be if one held ein zika, the other one must hold yesh zika. In a minute, we're going to say that's not true. You don't have to say that. But right now, we're going to assume that since one holds ein zika, the other one must hold yesh zika. Umi de Rabban Gamliel savar ein zika, turning now to Amud Bet, Rabbanan savar yesh zika. They must hold there is zika. Now, why is that going to be a problem? Because also the rabbis didn't require two chalitzas. Remember, all the cases we ended up saying, you just need one chalitza. right? You don't need two chalitzas. And katane seifa, v'chena ta'omer, and particularly they're going to say there's a problem with this particular case. It says, b'shnei yevamim v'yevama achat. If there's two yevamim, and one of them, we're now going to say that there's two yevamim and one yevama. And what did they say, right? That you only do chalitza to one of them, right? One of the yevamim does chalitza, the other one doesn't need. If that's the case, lema tavitiyufta de Rabba bar Rav Huna amar Rav. If you remember what Rav said, de amar Rabba bar Rav Huna amar Rav, chalitza psula tzricha lachzor al kol ha'achim. Rabba bar Rav Huna, who held right, he held yesh zika, and what did he hold? That when you have a chalitza psula and there's a number of brothers, each brother needs to get, remember those funny charts with like each brother giving chalitza to all of them? Each brother needs to do chalitza. So, right, she needs chalitza from all the brothers. And here in Shnei Yevamim Yevamacha, he only required one chalitza, one brother to do chalitza. That was sufficient. So the answer is going to be, as I kind of hinted at before, Amar l'cha Bar Huna, bein l'Rabban Gamliel, bein l'Rabbanan Savrei ein zika. Neither of them held by zika. They had a very specific machloket. Had nothing to do with yesh zika, ein zika. They both hold ein zika. And that's why, as regards the chalitza issue, they actually both agreed. Chalitza of one of them is sufficient. The question they debated was yesh get achar get or ein get achar get, or yesh mamar achar mamar ein. They weren't arguing over zika. And then we basically say that Shmuel and Rav, right, and these opinions that were brought, or Rav Huna in the name of Rav, were based on yesh zika. And they were based on ein zika, okay? And that's why there's no issues here. You can't argue and say, how could you possibly have said this? Look back to this machlokah, Rabban Gamliel and the rabbis that all agree about this. Oh, well, that's because they're in the position, they're in the camp that holds ein zika, and we're in the camp that holds yesh zika, and therefore you can't question between us and them. And then you don't have to assume, as I mentioned before, there's no assumption that just because Rabban Gamliel disagrees with the rabbis about ein get, achar get, and yesh get, right, doesn't mean that they had a different approach to zika. Amar. Now, right, which makes sense according to the explanation we brought, because the explanation had nothing to do with whether there's zika or whether there's not zika. Now we're going to go back again to another thing in this braita. And that's the last part of this braita. And then from the whole second half of Amabed is going to be a different, connected, but different. Asama amar bezo ma'amar bezo. Now we're going to the second case. Ma'amar achar ma'amal. Rabban Gamliel Omer, noten get larishona, v'choletzla v'asor b'krovotea mutar b'krovot shniya. Okay, that's basically what Rabban Gamliel says. Ein ma'amar achar ma'amal. Therefore, only the first one needs a get, right? And he should do chalitza with her better because she's already anyway forbidden to. Now, they're going to ask a very obvious question. Michti kasava Rabban Gamliel ema ma'ar achar ma'amal. If he holds that, then basically, let's look at the scenario. He gave ma'amar to one and he did ma'amar to the other. Okay. Now, in this scenario, if we hold a ma'amar achar ma'amal, we basically erase the second ma'amar, right? It's as if it never happened. Well, if it's as if it never happened, all he did basically is do ma'amar with one woman. What should the next step be? After ma'amar, what do you normally do? Yibum. And what did we say? He's not allowed to do yibum with her. He has to do chalitza. So why? If a ma'amar achar ma'amal, it's as if the second thing was an irrelevant action. He didn't do anything. He should be right. But what's the reason he can't do yibum with her? We assumed because he did ma'amar with the second woman, and he ended up doing this marriage relation, this kiddushin relationship, betrothal with two women and from the same house. You can't do that. But if we say that according to Rabban Gamliel, the second action was a totally irrelevant action, he should be allowed to do yibum with the first. So that's the Gemara's question right now. So we say, Michti kasava Rabban Gamliel ema amar achar ma'amal lishona nami tityaben. The first one should be able to do yibum because the second action was a totally irrelevant action. It's basically a classic case. If we did ma'amar with one, normally ma'amar is the action you do before you do yibum. So the answer, which is a bit of a strange answer, certainly the way the commentaries explain this, gzera dilma ate liyibume l'shniya. We're worried that maybe you'll end up doing yibum also to the second one. Okay, in other words, what? This is a bit of a strange worry, right? You don't do yibum to two women, but maybe you would get confused here. But even though the second ma'amar is not considered anything, you might think I did ma'amar and then I did yibum. Since I did ma'amar the second, I could do yibum as well to her. It's a little bit of a weird gzera why we're worried about this, but again, it's also the Gemara's answer to a difficult question, which is, right, I see someone's asking, but you gave her a get, but no, you only gave her a get because the law required you to give her a get. In other words, because you did ma'amar with the second woman, that requires you to get out of your relationship with the first and not continue to do yibum. Because again, you can't do two batim, right? You can't have two wives of your brother. You can't marry both of them. So if you did this ma'amar action with both of them, you theoretically can't do yibum. Do you have to do ma'amar? So you're asking before yibum. We've talked about that the rabbis instituted that you should do it. If you didn't do it, your yibum is still valid, but you should do ma'amar first. And we talked about that. That was, at least according to one of the opinions, and the one we hold by, it was to prevent yibum against her will, because ma'amar has to be with her will. Again, there was a machloket about it. Not everyone agreed, but most commentaries agreed. The main opinion agreed, said that that's why they instituted ma'amar, to make sure that people didn't take advantage of the women and do it against their will. But it had to be, it went in willingly, and that's why the rabbis instituted ma'amar first and then yibum. Also, to make it a little less primitive, that, you just go and sleep with her. The idea is you do an action first that's more marriage-like. So now, again, so the reason is we're basically going to be gozer, right? It's really not forbidden. Theoretically, according to Rabban Gamliel, the second ma'amar is meaningless, which means theoretically you could have really done yibum with the first, but the rabbi said we're worried that if we allow yibum, you might think you could do yibum with the second woman. And again, most say in addition, they thought somehow you could do yibum twice, which is, again, is a little bit strange why people would think that. But apparently maybe there was a lot of confusion about, and maybe it's possible because many people didn't have second wives. Okay, there's a lot of proof to think that people in this time period didn't. So in the case where there was, maybe you wouldn't know, right? Because we know what we see happening all the time. But if it was a very rare occurrence, then you might not know what to do in that case. You might actually think that you could do yibum with both, and therefore we prevent yibum at all in this case, and we just say do chalitza so that you avoid any kind of problems of that sort. Okay, now we're going to move on, although keeping a little bit within this, and we're going to have a statement that we've seen in many cases, which is a rabbi comes along and says, I'm going to collect a number of Tannaitic opinions from different places, and I'm going to tell you that they're all based on the same logic. Okay, and we're going to basically collect 5 different opinions of different rabbis in different places and say they're all based on the same concept. That what? Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Rabban Gamliel, Ubeit Shammai, Rabbi Shimon, Uben Azai, Rabbi Nechemia, Kulu Svira Lehu Ma'amar Koneh Kinyan Gamur. They all think the ma'amar is a full acquiring. Okay, that you've done a kinyan. It's basically serious. This is Beit Shammai is the famous. We've seen this before. What I want to point out is something very interesting here. Okay, before we go on, 1 second. What I want to point out is that this is different from most of the other occurrences because you're going to see they don't actually all prove that ma'amar is koneh kinyan gamur. This is a little bit of a weaker kind of putting together opinions. Some of them, we'll see one of them is it's doubtful, but it's a possibility. Okay, he looked at it as a doubt. Maybe ma'amar is koneh, maybe it's not. So the fact that he considered that it's possibly koneh, that was enough to say, it's in this category of rabbis. Okay, even though it's only maybe like a 50-50 chance. A bunch of them aren't even about ma'amar. A bunch of them are about other things that the rabbis said it's like ma'amar. And then if that's like ma'amar and that works, then we must assume ma'amar works. Okay, so it's a little bit different. We're not going to see directly the ma'amar is koneh kinyan gamur. And again, we get into the same problem of kinyan gamur. The first time we saw this statement, it wasn't clear. Is it really kinyan gamur? Is it just, remember we saw maybe lidchot et hatzara, we saw, right, her sister maybe. Okay, anyway, let's read inside. Rabban Gamliel had amara. So we just said, remember, that was how Abaye explained Rabban Gamliel. According to Rabban Gamliel, get is doche and ma'amar is koneh, right? B'miktzat. Again, remember we said it's not fully. That's why, again, this isn't koneh kinyan gamur, but it's effective in what it does. Beit Shammai. Okay, now we're going to get back to Beit Shammai. Let's open the presentation. Okay, Beit Shammai. We actually saw this before, but we'll read it again and we'll see it in the presentation inside. Ditnan, as it says in the Mishnah, Shlosha achim, there's 3 brothers, Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. Nisuin l'shtei achayot, okay, Yael and Chana. Ve'echad mufneh, one is not married at all, Levi is not married. So Reuven's married to Yael, Shimon is married to Chana. Meit echad mibalei achayot, va'asaba mufneh ma'amar. One of the brothers dies, Reuven dies. Yael, his wife, does ma'amar with Levi, okay, the brother who wasn't married. Then what happens? Shimon dies. So what happens? Levi already did ma'amar with Yael. Chana now falls to Yibum to Levi. So Levi has Zika of 2 women upon him who are sisters, which is a big problem. What did Beit Shammai say? Remember, Beit Hillel says you're stuck here. But Beit Shammai says, Beit Shammai omrim, ishto imo, because he already did ma'amar with Yael, she's his wife, basically. That means ma'amar is koneh kinyan gamur. And halazot tetzeh mishum achot isha. Right? And Chana has to leave because she's achot isha, right? She's now forbidden to him because she's the sister of his wife. So there you see Beit Shammai, that's the easy one. Okay, Beit Shammai says ma'amar koneh kinyan gamur. So we have Rabban Gamliel, we have Beit Shammai. Next, Rabbi Shimon, Titania. Okay, this is a bit of a strange case. We have a case where, okay, let's talk basics. A boy or a man, but here we're talking about a boy at age 9 and a day is already considered what we call ra'oi lebi'ah, potentially can have sexual relations. Now, this means yibum, right? If you talk about marriage, so marriage has to be with da'at, okay? You have to have knowledge. That happens at age 13 and a day. So what if, but yibum is all about intercourse, right? That's Yevamot yavo aleha. So what if a nine and a bit year old boy has intercourse with his Yevamot, and then another brother who's 9 and a day, or, again, it could be either they're twins or it could be he's a little bit older, right? But not yet 13, and as they could be in any range of there, also has intercourse with this Yevamot. Okay, let's not think about what the situation means, but right, she might already be a Gdolah. I think in the case she might be. I don't remember the details. We'll get to this also later. So now, in this case, the question is, what exactly is the status of this? Is the second bi'ah relevant or not? Okay, does it forbid the first brother now to be with her? Okay, because they both had relations with her. So Amarlu Rabbi Shimon, there's a debate, Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis about this. Amarlu Rabbi Shimon l'chachamim. Im bi'at rishon bi'ah sheni eina bi'ah. If the first bi'ah works, in other words, we don't know if it works or not. That's what Rabbi Shimon said. If the first one works, then the second one is not relevant because he's already married to her, right? So then the second one is just like bi'lat znut. The question is, I think, now that I'm remembering, 1 second, I think the question is, 1 second, I want to check one thing. Right, the issue here, 1 second, I'm just telling you. Right, he can't be Mekadesh a woman until he's older, but the Yibum, the question is, right, it's, by the way, because he can't be Mekadesher, okay, he doesn't have that, they assume that the status, and this is what's going to be important because this has nothing to do with Ma'amal. What they say is a child who does Yibum with, a woman, right? I think she would have to be older. Then she is acquired to him like Ma'amal. It has the status of Ma'amar, which basically means she's designated to him, right? And then she can't do Yibum with any of the other brothers. And when he becomes of age, he does basically the act again to acquire her through Yibum. Okay, so now just want to check one thing here. Okay, so if she fell to 2 of these younger brothers and they ended up with relations one after the other, then, right, so the question here is, does the second one disqualify the first one from fulfilling Yibum with her when he becomes of age? That's the question. Okay, now this is a case, it's like Ma'amar Achar Ma'amal, basically, because we're basically viewing this relationship that he had with her as Ma'amal. Again, I know this is a crazy case, but it's also unlikely that this such thing would happen. Okay, they're, again, describing theoretical cases. So now, Rabbi Shimon has a debate with the rabbis about this, about whether the second brother the first brother can do Yibum or not, or did the second brother basically preclude him? Do we view the second bi'ah as relevant? So he says the following. In bi'at rishon bi'ah sheni eina bi'ah. He basically thinks that the first one can do Yibum with her because he says, if we view the bi'ahs, and that's the whole issue is we don't know whether to view this as bi'ah or not. If we view it as bi'ah, then bi'ah sheni eina bi'ah. Then the second one is not because he already fulfilled Yibum. In bi'ah rishon eina bi'ah, bi'ah sheni eina bi'ah. If the first one, this is like we said before, the first one isn't anything, then the second one is obviously not anything. And how can it make it worse for the first one? It's basically an irrelevant action. So now what do we see here? Like I said before, ha bi'ah ben tesha ki ma'amar shavu Rabban. The rabbi said bi'ah ben tesha is like ma'amal. And what do you see here? V'kama Rabbi Shimon eina bi'ah. Right? Rabbi Shimon said, maybe it's bi'ah, maybe it's not bi'ah. And he did raise the possibility that maybe it is bi'ah, which means that he thinks the ma'amar could be koneh. Okay, so that's the third opinion. Ben Azai, Detanya Ben Azai, and here's where I said it's only a possibility, but the fact that he raises a possibility puts him on this list. Ben Azai Omer, Yesh Ma'amar Achar Ma'amar B'Shnei Yevamim V'Yevama Achat, Ve'em Ma'amar Achar Ma'amar B'Shnei Yevamot V'Yabam Echad. He says it works sometimes, okay? It depends on the scenario, which means he holds like Rabban Gamliel partially, which means also he holds at least somewhat that Ma'amar is koneh, because again, Rabban Gamliel is based on Ma'amar koneh. So in which case, he says there is a Ma'amar Achar Ma'amar if you have 2 Yevamot and 1 Yabam. And then the 1 Yabam does Yibam with one, does Ma'amar with one, and Ma'amar with the other. In that case, he agrees that a Ma'amar Achar Ma'amar, because the first Ma'amar is koneh. So there you see, he holds it again, partially. In one case, not in the other. Rabbi Nechemia, the last one, Ditnan, we saw this in the Mishnah. Rabbi Nechemia Omer, Echad Bi'ila, Echad Chalitza, Ben B'Tchila, Ben B'Emtze, Ben B'Sof, Ein Acharei HaKlum. Rabbi Nechemia had this unique approach. Doesn't matter if it's what we call Bi'ila Psula, if it happens after Ged or after Ma'amal. The Bi'ila basically is Yibum. You've fulfilled Yibum. That's different from what we saw today, right, where we said it doesn't. So now, Habi'ah Psula, Dik'ma'amar Shavyur Rabbanan. Bi'ah Psula, where you do Bi'ah after Ma'amar, it only has, right, it doesn't have the status generally of Yibum. It's more like Ma'amal. And what do you see here? Ein Acharei HaKlum. He doesn't take Ein Acharei HaKlum to say you fulfilled the mitzvah of Yibum, but what he does say is you're basically designated to this woman, right? And then to get out of it, you'd need a get, and anything you do after is an irrelevant action because you've already connected yourself to this woman and disconnected her ties with anybody else. And therefore, what do you see? V'katani ein acharei haklum, bi'ila psula works, and bi'ila psula is like ma'amar. Again, it's another where we're going to say this isn't exactly ma'amar. It's not talking about it directly, but it's talking about something that is compared to ma'amar, and you see it's koneh. So again, you see that even something that's like Ma'amar is koneh. Again, you have another opinion that Ma'amar is koneh kinyan gamor, even though it's not exactly kinyan gamor, as I said before. With that, we'll finish today's daf. Have a great day, everyone.